Oh, my name is Dean Contover. This is The Current Buzz. Thank you for watching today. Today we have an author, American author. I have to say American author, James Sullivan. You have written 4 books, right?
5.
5 books now, yeah. God. Okay, one of the books is right here. It's Which Side Are You On, right? I have it here, The 20th Century of American History in 100 Protest Songs. I read the book, and I want to say this to you, James. I relived my youth in many of the songs. I've seen many of the groups or the singers in this book. So we're going to talk about the book and his other books. He has another book here. He wrote a book on denim, right?
Yep.
And 7 Dirty Words. I don't have that book, and I don't have denim. And I have the other one. What was it? The football teams from Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard.
Yep. So, I mean, a wide variety of books on, you know, a variety of subjects, yeah.
Yeah. What's your next book?
Don't know yet.
Oh, you don't know
Working
yet?
on it, yeah. I'm not sure yet.
How about writing a book on baseball gloves? No one's written a book on baseball gloves. Who knows?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about the book a little bit. You know, I mean, you write for the Boston Globe, but you're not really a writer for them per se because you write books. And there's some conflict or something?
Well, no, it's not a conflict, but just
I
am from this area. I grew up here.
Right. Where did you grow up?
Framingham.
Framingham, okay.
And I live on the North Shore now.
Okay.
But in between, my wife and I moved years ago at this point. We lived in San Francisco for 10 years.
Right.
I worked for the Chronicle in San Francisco, writing for them. And then we wanted to move back. We had kids in San Francisco. Nobody's kids are born in San Francisco. But my 3 sons are all native San Franciscans because they're all born there. And when the third one was born, he's 15 now.
Wow.
When the third one was born, we sort of said, hey, our families are back east. We're going back east. So we moved back. And I, at that point, I actually had a contract to write my first book, as you mentioned, which is Jeans, A Cultural History of an American Icon. It's about, you know, the fact that we all wear jeans, but we don't really think much about them, but there's a lot of symbolism there.
Right. And old jeans are worth a lot of money.
Old jeans are worth a lot of money. But you know, so there's a lot of, you know, the way we tell the story of ourselves as Americans, a lot of that has to do with the way what we wear or how we present ourselves, and that's, you know, sort of embedded in jeans. So my first book sort of gave us the opportunity to quit my job at the Chronicle and move back. I've been freelancing for the Globe ever since.
Right.
So that's 15 years.
Is that what they call it, freelancing? Yeah.
So I mean, I write, you know, consistently.
Many articles,
yeah, a lot of stuff for the Globe. Been doing it for 15 years. It's been a great relationship, but I've also had the opportunity, because I'm freelance, to kind of make my own time, and I've written 5 books at this point. Yeah,
that's why I want to clarify that, you know, in case they see your name and so forth.
Sure.
I read the book. I enjoyed it. I think it should be read by every high school student, at least in English class, in regards to the history of music, in regards to American history.
Right. So one of the ideas behind it was that exactly that was that.
Oh, was it? Okay.
High school and college students. In fact, my middle son is at Ohio State right now, and he called me from a class that he's taking called The History of Rock and Roll, and he said, I just talked to the professor after class, and I told him that you wrote this book, and so the idea is when it comes out in paperback, the publisher wants to, like, this was meant for just a general readership.
Right.
You know, go on Amazon or go to your local bookstore and find a copy of it, and for general readers. But then when it comes out in paperback, the publisher, Oxford University Press, wants to approach teachers like the guy who's the instructor from my son's History of Rock and Roll class, and it kind of gives some idea of progressive movements in the 20th century in America, as told through the music that accompanied those movements. And so the idea is that a lot of the songs obviously were written for the movements, or were adopted by the movements. You know, We Shall Overcome being the obvious example, right?
Right.
Civil rights movement, that's an existing spiritual song that was adopted by that movement and was used in all the protests, all the marches. But
Even today.
Even today. But the idea, but then I expanded the idea so that I'm also writing about songs that you don't necessarily think of as classic protest songs.
Right.
There's disco songs in the book, there's blues songs in the book, there's punk rock songs in the book, in addition to Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, Blowin' in the Wind, Joan Baez. I mean, I talk about all those songs, obviously you need to when you're talking about protest music, but there's a lot of other protest music that maybe isn't quite the sort of accepted, stereotype of what constitutes a protest song.
A typical group was Devo, De-Evolution.
Yes, right.
And I saw them live
Oh, wow.
to tell you the truth,
Right.
many years ago.
Yeah.
And they were interesting.
Super interesting band, like a new wave punk band.
Yeah.
And they had a whole concept, and it was that, we're going backwards as a human race.
Right.
We're not making progress, we're actually going backwards. That's where the name comes from, de-evolution.
Evolution, right, exactly.
So yeah, they had, most of their songs, they were, at the beginning of the MTV era. I mean, that's a great example of what's in the book.
Yeah.
At the beginning
And it was a show band too. I mean, in a sense,
Sure.
all rock and roll is basically a
Of
show.
course.
You have to have a certain niche to make it.
And they had a whole
big.
shtick,
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
popular in the beginning of the MTV era. They wore the funny uniforms, they looked great on camera,
The hat,
but they were actually sort of presenting subversive ideas in the mainstream. So that's a good example.
Yeah, a good example. Civil rights. Give me. We shall overcome. We shall not be moved.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole. Another guy I saw was James Brown.
Right.
You bring up Tammy. I saw Tammy.
The Tammy Show.
The show.
Right.
When I was
In the movie theater?
Yeah.
Right, so the Tammy Show was the Teenage Music International.
Yeah.
It was a live, massive all-star concert
In
filmed.
1964.
Yeah, filmed in Southern California.
Right.
And the idea was that they would film the concert and then present it in movie theaters around the country, so that one group of kids would get to go to this show, but it wouldn't have to tour the country.
Right.
You film it once, and then you put it in the movie theaters.
Right.
And it was this sort of, famous show, but in part because, Leslie Gore was there, James Brown, Marvin Gaye,
Rolling Stones.
the Rolling Stones. And the famous story is that the Rolling Stones were pretty new at the time,
Right.
and they were going to go after James Brown, and James Brown looked at them and said, "I'm not going to let these little, skinny British kids, outdo me."
Mm-hmm.
So he blew the place up with a great set, and then the Stones, supposedly, the story goes, Mick Jagger was, sort of terrified, quaking in his boots to go after James Brown because he realized we can't top that.
Yeah.
But there were there's good stories from
What
that
I remember
show.
that was James Brown's show.
Right.
And I just was in my seat watching this guy, James Brown, with his cape and, falling down and doing that.
But the reason why I bring up the Tammy Show in the book is not for any of those guys. It's for Leslie Gore, who at the time was the biggest pop star of the moment. She was bigger than James Brown or the Rolling Stones at that time.
Right.
And so her song "You Don't Own Me" is an example that I use in my chapter on the women's movement.
Right.
And how she wrote that song just to say, look, I'm a teenage girl. I'm happy to be dating this guy, but you can't tell me what to wear. You can't tell me who else I can be with.
Right.
You don't own me. I'm happy to date you, but you don't own me.
In those days, that used to happen.
Right, exactly. And sort of 10 years later or so, when the feminist movement really, sooner than that, but in the early 70s, the feminist movement, the Equal Rights Amendment movement, adopted "You Don't Own Me" as an anthem. And Leslie Gore would always say, we didn't write that necessarily thinking of it as a protest song, but now that it's being used as one, great.
Yeah, I want to tell you a little history in regards to James Brown. I was in basic training down in South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina.
Right, where he was from.
And I went to a show.
Yeah.
And it was really bizarre because on the floor were African Americans on the floor,
and then the whites were in there.
If you look at Lowell Auditorium in downtown Lowell, all the whites were sitting up there, and the African Americans were on the floor dancing. Right. And there were 6 of us white guys from the north, that went to the show, and we were like, "Holy." What's going on here? Right. There was no.
Well, there were artists who, sort of eventually demanded that, we're not going to play to segregated audiences anymore, and that, so it's one of the many stories of this idea that music obviously impacts progressive movements. That artists saying, who were traveling to play in southern cities saying, well, we're not going to play if you tell us that the audience is going to be segregated. You got to let the kids hang out together if they want to.
Another guy, Jimi Hendrix, in regards to Woodstock, in regards to no one ever heard the Star-Spangled Banner played in that way. Right. And that was a big to-do initially when he played it the way he on his guitar.
Right. I mean, it's for those who maybe haven't heard it or aren't sure, at Woodstock he played this sort of wild, feedback-heavy rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, and some people thought it was sort of sacrilegious. It was it was disrespectful to the national anthem. And so what I found interesting was that maybe a few weeks or so after Woodstock, he was on. Hendrix didn't do a lot of TV interviews. He was a pretty shy, quiet guy. But he was on the Dick Cavett show, which
he was an airborne trooper, by the way,
Right.
with the 101st Airborne prior to the war. in
prior to
Vietnam.
him.
So he kind of knew what was going on.
Yeah.
Yep.
But so Dick Cavett said, so what do you think of people saying that was disrespectful? And he said, it hadn't even occurred to him. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I thought it was beautiful. I understand the anthem. I like the anthem, and I wanted to play it, and that's how I played it. But people thought it was in some way. Well, I mean, a lot of people took it that he was sort of subtly or not so subtly protesting Vietnam because so much of the feedback sounds like bombs overhead and machine gun fire and all of that.
Right. We're talking to James Sullivan. He's written a book called "Which Side Are You On?" 20th Century American History and 100 Protests. In case you just tuned in. And we're going to talk about certain things. In chapter 1, you talk about nonviolence. James Brown's body, who I remember as a kid.
John Brown's body.
John Brown's, I'm sorry. James Brown. We were talking about James Brown. Thank you for the correction. Yeah. What's that about? What's the nonviolence about?
Yeah, so, I mean, the idea of that chapter was that I think that the immediate thing that people, when you say protest music, the first thing that most people, I think, in this country of a certain age at least, think of is the Vietnam era musicians protesting against the war, deciding that their generation, no longer felt good about going to fight in this war that nobody was quite sure what the purpose was, and. What was interesting to me in researching that, I mean, I sort of knew this and obviously researched more deeply as I was writing the book, but yes, that's a period of the country's history that was pretty clearly about protest, but popular music that protests the military action goes all the way back at least to, well, you mentioned John Brown's body, but it goes all the way back to every other war we've ever had.
World War I?
Yeah. So, what I did was I opened with that chapter with, sort of the Country Joe thing, the chant.
Country Joe and the Fish.
At Woodstock.
Woodstock.
What are we, 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? But then sort of scaled all the way back to say this stuff has been going on at least since World War I when, that happened to coincide World War I with the dawning of the electronic era when people started having record players, Victrolas, radios in their homes. So popular music was no longer, you didn't buy sheet music and somebody played it on a piano at home. It was more like you bought a record for the first time. And a number of, sort of top hit songs of the World War I era were by pacifists saying, please let's not get involved in that overseas war. And there's one song in particular which has endured to a certain extent, but was a big hit at the time. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. And it was not controversial at all until it was. It was not, it was a hit song. Most people agreed with it. And then the tides turned and the U.S. Sort of sentiment went from let's not get involved, that's their problem, to let's definitely get involved. That's becoming a much bigger problem for the international community. And so the tide turned quickly, and suddenly the song was not, suddenly the song became controversial after the fact, because people were saying, Teddy Roosevelt was quoted as saying, that's your duty to send your boy to war if we're at war. And there were jokes about, other songs that should be written. He made jokes about, other songs should be written, with mamas raising their boys. But but the song was a hit as it stood, and it was an anti-war song.
Right. Workers Unite, Chapter 2.
Yeah.
And then you have Chapter 3, Civil Rights. Anything on that? Rights of Woman. The songs I remember, The Environment, Psycho Killer was an interesting song.
Yeah.
And I remember that everyone was singing.
Talking Heads. So
Talking Heads.
I mean, so the idea is that each chapter takes another progressive era, like you said, the women's movement, civil rights, the gay rights movement, LGBT.
Right.
Each chapter sort of gives a little, overview of the movement and how those rights came to be fought for and won.
Right.
And then I tried to pick 10 songs that either were specifically tied to the movement, or that whatever that movement was,
right,
or songs that, like the Leslie Gore song, that were not written to be protest songs, but then became such later on.
Were the songs written for the movement or after the movement, and people picked them up like Leslie Gore's
both.
song?
I mean, So We Shall Overcome existed before the civil rights movement really even began.
Right.
Or as it was beginning in the 1930s or 1940s,
right,
but really, became a common, everyday idea in America in the 60s, when the civil rights movement sort of overtook the nightly news, basically.
Chapter 9's No Nukes. Well, what's the story? Which songs were?
So one of the main things about that chapter is that, that chapter, among other things, gave me a chance to write locally, because the no nuclear power movement really started both in Western Mass with the
Clamshell Alliance.
Well, and the Clamshell Alliance in Seabrook, right? So, it's sort of very local for us.
Right.
And every other, so at the 1999 protests against the World Trade Commission meeting in Seattle, those protesters specifically looked at the Clamshell Alliance playbook to decide how to what's the proper way to go about nonviolent protests when there's going to be opposition and when you might get jailed for protesting.
Right.
What do you do?
And you're allowed to, in this country, what makes it great is to demonstrate in a nonviolent way.
Right. So, so in the No Nukes chapter, among other things, I talked about how the No Nukes concert, there was a 1979, a big, huge concert outdoors in New York City with like Jackson Browne and Bonnie Raitt and Bruce Springsteen, who were all huge stars at the time.
Yeah, right.
And that was a moment when the rock and roll community went from, every once in a while we'll write a song that, because we're supportive of a certain movement, to we can actually use the fame and fortune that we have amassed as pop stars to really change the whole conversation about an issue. And so because people like Bonnie Raitt and Jackson Browne stood up and said, we're putting on this pretty massive, and the record was, the live record was a big deal at the time, sold a lot of copies. And so it really sort of pushed the argument forward, whereas lots of people at that point were probably like, nuclear power, it doesn't mean anything to me. I don't really know that there's a nuclear power plant anywhere near my house, so it's not an issue to me.
Or didn't know there was one.
Or didn't know that there was an issue. And then they see, people like Bonnie Raitt and Bruce Springsteen talking about it in Rolling Stone, suddenly turns the tide on.
Well, you think
a
3 Mile Island had a lot to do with that?
Yeah, of course.
Situation
right. Which was what, 78 or 79?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That was a big push in regards to that. I don't know Chapter 7 that much about gay pride. I couldn't relate to it. I know you talk about Stonewall and so forth. And there's a lot in the book about it. And I couldn't relate to because I wasn't in that environment in regards to growing up.
So one of the most interesting things.
I want to talk about that.
One of the most interesting things that I found in that chapter was that somebody compiled. There's a lot of history. The Stonewall, for those who don't know, was a gay bar in New York
owned by
mafiosos who knew that they could sort of charge extra prices for the drinks and water them down because their clientele really had no leverage.
Right.
We'll give you guys a place to hang out, but you're supposed to be keeping this
QT
on the QT. Yeah. So if we water down your drinks and overcharge you for them, you can't complain, because who are you going to complain to? They're going to come break the place up and kick you out, because at the time being gay was in itself, sort of a arrestable offense.
Even in the military.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found fascinating, a lot of people have documented the protests that happened at the Stonewall Inn and sort of kicked off the early years of the LGBT rights movement. Was that someone documented what was on the jukebox at the Stonewall Inn.
I see.
And it was, in many cases, regular pop songs, not unlike the Leslie Gore song, where, sort of boy meets girl pop songs, girl meets boy pop songs, but all the gay men in the bar had adopted the songs and said, like what's it? I'm trying to think of the song that I mentioned, third finger, left hand, or something like that. It's about we're going to put a ring on it. We're going to make this official, and the guys would sing it to each other, and it was sort of an act of defiance for them to say, look, we are who we are.
Right.
These songs, they're not just about boys and girls falling in love with each other. They can be about boys and boys falling in love with each other, and that was an act of defiance at the time. So.
Right. You talked about immigration. That's a big one.
Well, obviously, right.
What do you remember about that? Writing about that?
Well, so one of the things that I tried to do with this book was to, I go through 9 chapters of 9 different issues, 10 songs in each one that apply to the issue or helped move the issue forward.
You have 100 songs.
Help define it, right. And then the 10th chapter is to say, yes, I'm talking mostly about the 20th century, but one of the reasons why I wrote the book in the first place was that it occurred to me during the Occupy Wall Street movement 10 years ago. There were a lot of kind of hand-wringing stories in the media about how, this is a big movement, it's in the news every day, but we don't see a lot of music coming out of it. And where are all the great protest songs like the 60s?
Right.
Part of that is because the whole culture has become diffuse in that, in other words, in the 60s, everybody listened to the same radio stations. There were a handful of radio stations.
Correct.
There were a handful of TV stations.
WBCN.
You listened to Top 40. You listened to WRKO or WBCN, and so did the guy who lived next door to you. Now the guy who lives next door to you has a Spotify playlist for what he likes.
That's correct.
And the people on the other side listen to Pandora, and you listen to your stuff, and everybody's in their own little silos. So it's harder for any one song to rise to the to get over the hump.
Good point.
To where the whole country gets it, or understands what it's about. But I wanted to show that in spite of that difficulty, there's plenty of protest music out there if you know where to look for.
Country Western?
Sure. There's country and Western protest songs. There was a song in the 70s by Loretta Lynn called The Pill, which her record company...
I remember.
Her record company wouldn't let her put, sort of delayed for 2 or 3 years because they were afraid, they were deathly afraid of that song coming out. But it was at the height of the Equal Rights Amendment era.
9 to 5?
Yeah, exactly. It's a fun song, and you don't think of it in terms of, but it is. It's about, women deserve a place at this table too. We're not just the secretary or whatever. So
you have a book over there. Let me look at it. This is another book he's written. It's called 7 Dirty Words: The Life and Crimes of George Carlin from New York City. He lived in Manhattan and grew up in Manhattan, and he always had a New York accent. When he.
So I was born in Queens. I grew up in Framingham, but I was born in Queens. So I've always felt 1 foot in New York, 1 foot in Boston, which is unusual.
Well,
still a Red Sox guy and not a Yankee guy, though.
Oh, too bad. That's too bad. I was born in Manhattan, believe it or not. But I'm a Yankee guy, and so.
Interesting.
It's interesting.
You admit that in public, okay.
People know that, I think. They know it now. Believe me, there's a lot of Yankee fans in this area.
Oh, I know.
Believe me, there are a lot of them.
We go up to, my wife's family has a place in Maine, and there's a lot of New Yorkers in Maine.
Yeah, even in Vermont, there's a lot of New Yorkers, and it spills over, in Western Mass.
Sure.
Because they listen to radio, they listen to the New York Yankees on the radio from New York rather than Boston, because the Berkshires were sort of a barrier.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they were listening to Albany stations that were playing in Vermont. It is what it is. And thank you for coming on the show. I mean, obtain this book because your children will one day read it in high school or college.
I hope so. I mean, that's the idea. I've had a couple of. I've had a lot of good readings and events around the release of the book, but the most rewarding ones have been with school children who are as engaged. The current grade of kids that are going through high school and college right now, like my kids, are so engaged. Maybe more so than since the '60s. As far as their big thing is the climate movement and and individual rights movements.
Thank you for being on the show. I believe it.
Appreciate it.
We could do another half hour. I mean, it's just, time is.